Hi, my name is Linda Hoff. As a volunteer with the League of Women Voters of the Flint area, I'd like to welcome you to this presentation on the history of voting in the United States. I'm pleased to present this overview of material meant to give you a broad perspective of some of the challenges faced by citizens over the course of our nation and the responses intended to address them. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We advocate for fair voting and access, educate voters on the ballot and their rights as voters, and work to engage residents in their communities. Here are a few warm-up questions to get you in the frame of mind. George Washington was not part of a political party, nor did he believe in them. He was convinced that a party system would divide the nation and add unnecessary destructive competition into politics. 2, the first voters were white, male, and property owners. 3, the first 3 words of the Constitution are "we, the people." 4, while the first 3 are typically pretty easy, this one is often a bit of a stumbling block for people to remember. It was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that made it illegal for states or districts to make it harder for people to vote. Sadly, on June 26, 2013, in a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court invalidated key provisions of the VRA, claiming that the reasons that were used to support the legislation were no longer a threat to voters. The expression "no taxation without representation" was the battle cry that launched the American Revolution. Yet once the war was decided, the victors somehow forgot to apply that message to the vast numbers of people who now called the United States home. People of broad diversity were left without representation or rights in this newly minted free democracy. Fair representation was also a concept in the various suffrage movements and more recently, the anti-gerrymandering movement. This slide gives you some topic areas that have been used as a means to block voters. We'll touch on these topics in a very brief manner to help give you some perspective into the various challenges that you might not be familiar. Starting with property ownership, we already know that the 3 key attributes to the first U.S. voters were white, male, and property owners. The Rock the Vote video shown here can't be launched from the recording. However, most people find the 3-minute video very informative and certainly more fun to watch than me. So I would recommend that you search for it in your browser and play the 3-minute video on your own. Article 6 in the U.S. Constitution disavowed religious tests as a condition for holding public office. However, following European custom, all 13 of the original American colonies required an attestament of religious belief as a prerequisite for individuals to hold public office. The case of Torcaso v. Watkins was finally heard by the Supreme Court in 1961. The case challenged Maryland's state constitution requirement that every official declare a belief in the existence of God. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that religious tests were a violation of the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment and held that religious tests violate the religion clauses. However, 8 states, including Arkansas, Maryland, Mississippi, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, continue to have religious exclusions in their state constitution, even though it's been determined that they cannot be upheld. The U.S. has had a history of some form of voter disenfranchisement since its inception. It is disappointing that the nation created with a vision of democracy and people's freedom has seen so many challenges for fair access to voting and representation. Too often in the history of our nation, the law on the books didn't necessarily translate to what people believed it would be or what was happening when people attempted to vote. It wasn't until President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the United States applied strong legal parameters to the question of voting rights, filling in many loopholes that for many years permitted election officials to discriminate against citizens who sought to cast their ballot on Election Day. The Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo included several statements that promised freedom of choice and citizenship for those who opted to stay in the newly acquired territory as U.S. citizens. The implementation of the treaty and fulfillment of the promises held within it was more than a bit complicated. For our purposes here, we'll simply state that the promise of full rights of U.S. citizenship did not translate to full voting rights for many of the people. With Congress's passage of the Indian Citizenship Act, the government of the United States conferred citizenship on all Native Americans born within the territorial limits of the country. The right to vote, however, was governed by state law. Sadly, Indigenous Americans continue to be turned away from casting ballots. In New Mexico and Arizona, Indigenous Americans were not allowed to vote until 1948, when courts ruled in their favor against state government. In Utah, Native Americans had to wait until 1957, as these were the last of America's indigenous people to be formally recognized as citizens. Yet in April of 2017, North Dakota Governor Burgum signed into law a bill that required voters to bring a form of identification with them to the polls that included their legal name, date of birth, and current residential street address. This was despite the fact that addresses were not routinely used or assigned on reservations, and the state of North Dakota abolished voter registrations in 1951. The bill stipulated that a driver's license, a state-issued ID, or tribal government-issued ID were acceptable forms of identification, and allowed for other documents such as utility bills or paychecks to supplement missing or outdated information. As is so often the case when dealing with underserved populations, what would be a fairly reasonable requirement for a person living in mainstream community, this presented a steep challenge to people living in reservation communities because these documents were not readily used or available. The law was challenged, but the Supreme Court refused to take the case, so the law stayed in place. Advocacy groups quickly mobilized to help those who lacked proper identification and documentation. In 2018, they were able to provide about 2,000 of the estimated 5,000 persons who did not have the proper ID to vote. The Chinese Exclusion Act, also known as the Immigration Act of 1882, was federal legislation aimed at suspending immigration for a specific nationality. It prohibited Chinese laborers, both skilled and unskilled, from entering the country. The passage of the act represented the outcome of years of racial hostility and anti-immigrant agitation by white Americans, and it set the precedent for later restrictions against immigration of other nationalities. This legislation started a new era in which the United States changed from a country that welcomed almost all immigrants to a gatekeeping one. It took nearly 100 years from the birth of the USA to bring the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. While it did not end the practice of voter disenfranchisement, it has been used repeatedly by the Supreme Court when ruling on election-related challenges. In a strange twist of words, the 15th Amendment outlawed discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, it did not specifically grant African American men the right to vote. Disappointingly, it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that practices such as literacy tests and poll taxes were finally reined in. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, granting women of the U.S. the right to vote. That date is now referred to as Women's Equality Day. The League of Women Voters is an organization born of the suffrage movement, which is the act of advocating for the right to vote. The purpose of the League was to teach women how to use their newfound power as voters. For the past 100 years, that work has continued as we work to ensure fair access to the ballot, fair elections, and educated and engaged citizens. It should be noted that our advocacy extends to all voters and membership in the League. The League is open to persons age 16 years and up and those who support the ideals of the League. A poll tax, otherwise known as a head tax or capitation tax, applied to all citizens and was used by many states as a means of funding government. As states determined that property taxes were a more effective means of funding government, head taxes were removed in practice. That is, until a number of states discovered the potential of abusive poll taxes as a means of disenfranchising select voters. The effort to keep voters of color away from the polls paid off. In the state of Mississippi, fewer than 9,000 of the 147,000 voting age African Americans were registered to vote after 1890. In Louisiana, where more than 130,000 Black voters had been registered in 1896, the number plummeted to 1,342 by 1904. In Harper v. the Virginia Board of Elections, a 6-3 decision held that a poll tax violated the Equal Protection Clause. The majority reasoned that the eligibility to vote has no rational connection to the wealth of an individual. Thus, the poll tax could not meet the heightened standard of review applied to restrictions on voting, which is the fundamental right under the 14th Amendment. The 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, ended the use of poll taxes, at least in federal elections. Literacy tests were a tool used to effectively and disproportionately turn away minority voters, especially African Americans. In many places, if the official administering the test wanted a person to pass, they could ask a very easy question such as, "Who is the President of the United States?" The same official might require a Black person to answer every single question correctly in an unrealistic amount of time in order to pass. Ultimately, the tester determined who passed and who failed. These questions will be answered in the next slide. Quickly, because time is ticking and time is short if you are not of the preferred voting race. The answer to number 1 is 2. The answer to number 2 is noon. The answer to number 3 is 10 days. The "it depends" is because if 10 days pass without a signature and Congress is still in session, the bill becomes law. If Congress is not in session when the 10 days expire, the bill suffers a pocket veto and does not become law. Louisiana has the distinction of having had the most challenging literacy tests, especially as they were unrelated to government or actual voting. The next slide shows you the correct answer. If you have interest, you might want to use your browser to search for videos about the Louisiana literacy test, in particular when Harvard University students took the test and failed the 1964 Louisiana literacy test. Now, I'm going to let you look this over very quickly and try and write down your response, because you have to pretend that you are one of those people trying to get registered to vote and you are under strict time limits. Okay, here it goes. Is this the answer you got? Likely not, because the test was designed for you to fail. On June 25th, 2013, in a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court ruled to invalidate Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, a key provision in protecting voters from unfair changes in voting law. In writing for the majority, Justice Roberts said, "Our country has changed. While any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to current conditions." In his statement, he said that Congress may still act to remedy any continuing concerns, but must do so with contemporary data. Justice Ginsburg countered that the nation's commitment to justice had been disserved by the decision, and continued to say the focus of the Voting Rights Act had properly changed from first-generation barriers of ballot access to second-generation barriers like racial gerrymandering. She reminded the court that the law had been effective in thwarting such efforts. Texas quickly announced that a voter identification law that had been previously blocked under the Voting Rights Act would go into effect immediately, and that redistricting maps there would no longer need federal approval. Changes in voting procedures in the places that had been covered by the law, including ones concerning restrictions on early voting, will now be subject only to after-the-fact litigation. In her comments on the Voting Rights Act decision, Justice Ginsburg mentioned 2 challenges which would continue to prevail by removing protections from the VRA. They were gerrymandering and at-large voting. So what is gerrymandering and how is it bad for democracy? Every 10 years following the decennial census, the number of U.S. congressional representatives is redistributed according to the population of the U.S. Additionally, political boundaries across the nation must be redrawn to effectively meet changing populations. In 2018, Michigan voters passed a constitutional amendment to create an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, whose job it will be to bring balance, integrity, and transparency to the process. On the eve of the 2020 census, that amendment is still being challenged in the courts. The League of Women Voters of Michigan has been educating voters on the problems of gerrymandering since before the redrawing of political lines that followed the 2010 census. Rules that are required to be considered include the constitutional requirement of equal population of districts and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that prohibits plans that intentionally or inadvertently discriminate on the basis of race, thereby diluting the minority vote. Additionally, most states have a requirement for compact districts with contiguous lines. This image is one devised by Stephen Nass of the Washington Post. It demonstrates how gerrymandering practices can be used to manipulate political lines to achieve a desired outcome. Following the 2010 census, Michigan's legislature was under Republican control. The party controlled the drawing of lines, worked without any transparency, and did not include any public input. Under the Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission, there are specific roles that are aimed at ensuring the commission works in the best interest of the citizens of Michigan. At-large voting is a process by which a group of people represent a whole body versus a particular district. At-large voting is forbidden at the federal level. Proponents of at-large voting say it's more impartial as representatives are representing the whole body. Opponents of the system say such a system is a powerful tool used to block out smaller voices, typically that of minority populations. At-large voting systems are prevalent at the municipal level, and a number of communities employ at-large voting in some way. Here are some of the key roles related to voting in Michigan. You can check out all roles related to Michigan elections at the Michigan Voter Information Center, which can be reached at michigan.gov/vote. The Voting Rights Act opened a number of opportunities for people who had previously suffered from voting disenfranchisement. Sadly, it did not stop efforts to continue trying to block people from voting. After decades of worsening political gamesmanship regarding voting rights, the League of Women Voters of Michigan was a key participant in introducing a ballot proposal that would change Michigan's constitution to ensure basic, fair voting rights for all of Michigan's citizens. This slide is a summary of voting rights that were each adopted in 2018 under Proposition 3, referred to as Promote the Vote. Prop 3 was overwhelmingly supported by Michigan citizens and passed in 80 of Michigan's 83 counties with 70% of the total vote. The League of Women Voters works hard to assess practices related to voting, to identify issues and advocate for fair and accessible voting for all of our citizens. If you would like to get involved in our effort, feel free to reach out to a local league. The more people we have paying attention, the better our elections will be. In this graph representing voter turnout from 1978 to 2018, you can clearly see that the 18 to 55-year-old population, the green line, with over 62% of the voting turnout, had a very formative influence in our 2018 midterm election year. They've had the potential to be an even more powerful influence in 2020 if they simply exercise it. The gold line represents those born prior to 1965, making those over 55 years of age a less powerful voting bloc. In this graph from the Pew Research Center, we see a more detailed graphical representation of birth years that define specific generation and the projected potential voting power in 2020. Generation Z, the dark gold in the bottom right, represents those born after 1996, the 18 to 24-year-olds. The millennials, the medium gold, represent those born between 1981 and 1996, the 25 to 39-year-olds. Generation X, the light gold one through the middle of the graph, represent those born between 1965 and 1980, the 40 to 55-year-olds. The two green tinted lines are the boomers and the silent generation, which comprise about 37% of the population. They were born in 1964 and earlier. These citizens are 55 years of age and older. According to Rock the Vote, today's young adult population is boosted by 10 to 12,000 Americans every day. Thank you for your attention to this presentation on the history of voting in the U.S. and the promise of full rights to all citizens in the U.S. Here are a few resources you can use to find more information. The League of Women Voters is open to persons aged 16 years and up who share our ideals about fair and secure elections, strengthening representation of citizens, and encouraging civil civic behavior. If you have any questions or would like to get involved in our efforts, feel free to reach out to a local league. The more people we engage, the better our elections and government will be. This concludes the historical part of our education presentation. Thank you for your attentiveness.